Final Fantasy Versus 13 is dead. That's the headline that Kotaku ran on July 20th, 2012, with them saying its development and resources had actually been folded into another game, the next mainline entry, Final Fantasy 15. The PlayStation 4 hardware was on the horizon, and Versus 13 had been in the works for over 6 years at this point, and everyone was wondering, where is this game? Square Enix then took to damage control the situation by then President Yoichi Wada tweeting out that Versus 13 was indeed still in development. But the reality behind the scenes was far different. So please go ahead and hit the subscribe button as the channel pushes toward its goal of 110,000 subscribers. This is the complicated, messy, and dire situation that is the development history of Final Fantasy 15. The truth is, Final Fantasy Versus 13 was indeed cancelled in 2012. The company had been internally deliberating on whether to make Final Fantasy Versus 13 a numbered title a year into its development. There were plenty of reasons for hesitation, however, as Versus was planned to be a large departure from the FF series. It would be the first game to use full-on action combat, and it would feature much more graphic depictions, leading it to almost certainly being an M-rated game. However, the scope that Nomura had originally envisioned was unprecedented and would require a massive amount of investment. For this project to be successful, it couldn't live in the shadow of Fabula Nova Crystallis. While Final Fantasy XIII has received its flowers in recent years, in the 2010s, it's hard to overstate just how polarizing the game actually was. According to Tabata, after 6 years of work on Versus, only a quarter of the game was complete, despite all the time that had gone into it. The reasons for this were numerous. The fact that Crystal tools had been over-optimized to get Final Fantasy XIII out of the door fast. A game that was built around corridors, thus making it entirely incompatible with Versus's open-world ambitions. Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 absolutely falling apart, and Versus staff being removed from the project in order to piece together a Realm Reborn. The original planned release window for Versus was to be delivered no later than 2014, a date that would absolutely not be met. As continuous setbacks would delay Versus, the turn of the hardware generation was also happening. They wanted to make Versus a cross-generation title for both the PlayStation 3 and the PlayStation 4. However, an initial alpha version of the game was produced in 2012 for PS3, and the team concluded that the current generation hardware was a brick wall that could not handle Nomura's vision of a seamless open world. The PS3 version, and all the work done on Versus 13, could not carry over to the PS4 version. The only way forward was to kill the project, and it would have to be reborn as a flagship title. The project at this point had 200 people working on it, and it would have to be downsized to just 20. Development would completely reset from the ground up. This quickly became a top priority within the company. Amidst the crisis, then President Yoichi Wada officially requested Hajime Tabata and his Final Fantasy Type 0 team join the project in July of 2012, though it wouldn't be announced to the public until much later. Tabata entered as a co-director alongside Tetsuya Nomura, and while publicly it looked like Tabata was just going to be supporting Nomura, the plan really was for him to take over. Upon his arrival, Tabata described the production team as exhausted and fretful following the project's internal collapse. He initiated a reset of the development timer, encouraging staff to view it as a new project rather than a continuation of a failed one. And it's important to note here, it wasn't just the staff that was demoralized around this project. Square Enix as a whole was. Tabata revealed at GDC that Square Enix considered the Final Fantasy brand endangered and diminished, with them projecting under 5 million units for Final Fantasy 15. If you follow this channel, you may have seen this clip before, but it continues to remain relevant.
So right after I was kind of like named director of Final Fantasy 15, I talked to the regional sales head and received the sales forecast from each region. So I was told by everyone that switching away from normal turn-based combat was unwise, and that the Final Fantasy brand had diminished and was in danger.
Combine this with the fact that Final Fantasy XIII had been incredibly polarizing, and Lightning Returns barely breaking 1 million units sold, the Final Fantasy brand internally looked like it was finished. However, one of the first things that Tabata did was raise the stakes. He wanted to top the internal projections of under 5 million by selling 6 million units. An absolutely insane gamble for the time. Behind closed doors, things are moving quickly as the company was faced with little choice. It had been 2 years since the last trailer for Final Fantasy Versus 13. Doubts that the title would ever be released were beginning to surface. Then, that E3, everything would change.
これが対をなす幻想。いや、世界は常に変化する。15番目だ。
Final Fantasy Versus 13 was now officially and publicly Final Fantasy 15, with a debut trailer that is still regarded as one of the best video game trailers of all time. This trailer blew people away, showing off brand new set pieces, brand new gameplay, new graphics, over-the-top moments, and what looked like a game that was too good to be true. All the years we had spent waiting was culminating in a masterwork that felt like it was beyond our wildest dreams. A massive open-world RPG that had set pieces that rivaled Naughty Dog's Uncharted. Even though they restarted development of the game, the public perception was that the title had been 7 years in the making. But in reality, this trailer only reflected 1 year of development time. This is part of why, if you look at the character models in this trailer, they look incredibly rough and unfinished. This is merely speculation, but it's entirely possible these models were taken straight from the PS3 build of Versus. Though in either case, this was the first real clue to how early this game was into development. On the surface, this looked like the same game, but upgraded and rebranded. But internally, it could not be further from the truth. Drastic shifts were happening creatively on the project. Nomura was still publicly credited as the director. However, internally, Tabata had already begun merging the Versus team with his Business Division 2 team that worked on Type 0. Tabata said he would meet with Nomura and try to preserve as much as Versus's story and concepts as he could going into this project. Which I think when we consider things that Nomura has done since then, you can surmise that from his point of view, that really did not happen. He also asked Versus 13 writer Kazushige Nojima, best known for his work on Final Fantasy 7, 8, 10, and the Kingdom Hearts series, for his permission to change the scenario as well. And this is where things get fairly contentious, with him saying, quote, "Because the game itself was incomplete, there really wasn't a whole lot brought over, if I'm speaking honestly. It's pretty difficult to compare apples and oranges in this case. You have something that was incomplete and never fully formed. Versus was more of an idea than an actual game, whereas what we've created here is a complete finished product. However, because the game had already been presented via trailers and other forms of media to the users, one of my goals in developing 15 was to preserve the elements that users were aware of and excited about. Once something like that is out in the open, you can't really ignore it. People are expecting it. They're excited about it. So it's something they have to take into account, and yeah, it sort of serves as an inspiration in a way. When you're tying together the start and end, you know there are going to be some elements in there that don't quite fit in this new conception. To the team's credit, they did work as much as they could to include what they could to fit into this new idea. But there were some aspects, of course, that just didn't work. That might have been true on the gameplay front. However, the story of Versus simply being ideas, concepts, is a bit difficult to believe. For starters, back in June of 2010, Nomura said that the scenario for Versus 13 was complete. Noctis's Japanese voice actor says he still has the script for Final Fantasy Versus 13, and says he would love to talk about it someday. If he has the script, then Versus was a finished story. But knowing these statements, I'll leave it up to you to decide what really happened. The Final Fantasy 15 wasn't initially meant to be one game. It was meant to be part of a larger epic, a multi-game project that was said to have multiple direct sequels. trailers, with Nomura saying, quote, "In the trailer, there was a line that read, 'A World of the Versus Epic,' which suggests that it'll be part of an epic. While Final Fantasy XV will have one climax, as a story we plan to continue it further. As for how it will be released, we'll announce that later on. However, having you wait a long time for the next title isn't something we would desire, though these sequels unfortunately would never materialize. Square Enix wanted Nomura working on Kingdom Hearts 3 and Final Fantasy VII Remake instead, with them deciding at this time that Final Fantasy XV should be delivered in a single game, when it was originally presumed to be a trilogy. The story of Final Fantasy Versus 13 was centered around Reaper worship. However, they wanted Final Fantasy XV to be a title that could be sold in all markets. Tabata said on Square Enix's own forums, quote, "By the way, in Versus 13, Lucis was set as a country of Reaper worship. This setting is a violation of the age rating criteria for games in some countries, so we cannot push these themes. To replace these themes, we have a backbone setting of black as a special color, and I hope you'll wait for more information to come on this." Though he never specifically stated which country's age rating criteria this would violate, it's often speculated that it'd be the Chinese rating boards that wouldn't accept this. They have a lot of rules around the depictions of skeletons, reapers, or anything promoting cult-like worship, making releasing something like Versus next to impossible. But since he didn't specifically say which countries this would be a problem for, this is all just speculation. As these plot changes would come, it also meant that the music of Versus 13 would have to change alongside it. According to an Edge magazine interview, only a third of the finished music composed for Versus 13 made it into the final game of 15. It is insane to think there are so many finished Shimomura tracks that we will never get to hear. But even still, the biggest changes to the game had yet to reveal themselves. The game was supposed to have multiple playable characters, and it did eventually get this in a post-launch patch. But at the time, it was announced that this was going to be cut from the game, with Tabata saying, quote, "If rather than only controlling Noctis, users were able to control 4 or 5 characters, say, the 4 guys and then Core for example, it would be really hard to bring all 5 of those characters and the way they feel to the same level of satisfaction as one character, given the time restrictions, budget limitations, and so on. So because controlling all of those characters was a bit of an impossible goal, we decided it'd be more reasonable to create party characters with good AI, and make them feel realistic in order to push the hardware. Versus 13 was going to be worked on by Kingdom Hearts' Tokyo team, and be an evolution of the type of gameplay we saw in Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix. When Tabata took over, however, he wanted to make sure that the game played much more realistically, with him saying, quote, "When we shifted to the new hardware, PS4 and Xbox One, the goal was to create something more realistic. You know, have the characters from Versus 13 carried over, but instead of these caricatures, if you will, these really stylistic characters, the goal was to make them feel human. They became living, breathing people, going on a journey in a realistic world. So rather than focus on a combat system like the very stylized, cartoonish Kingdom Hearts approach, we went with something that feels more realistic. You have characters that feel pain, that respond to actions of not only combatants, the enemy combatants, but also your comments too, right? And again, this focuses on pushing the limits of the latest technology. Final Fantasy XV project faced more challenges than just creating an ultra-ambitious open-world game. They were also creating a brand new state-of-the-art game engine. Luminous engine aimed to bridge the gap between pre-rendered CGI and real-time gameplay. This vision was famously showcased in the 2012 Agni's Philosophy technical demo, which absolutely stunned the industry by just how incredible these visuals were. This was the type of fidelity normally seen in Square Enix's pre-rendered cinematics being delivered in real time. What made Luminous so technically advanced was its early and aggressive adoption of physically based rendering. This allowed the engine to simulate how light realistically interacts with different materials. The engine also featured a sophisticated global illumination system, which was crucial in achieving the game's 24-hour day-night cycle. All of these features are awesome, but they also presented numerous challenges as they couldn't just focus on developing content for the game. They were building a house while setting its foundation. Because the engine was being made simultaneously with the game and its assets, the team faced a state of workflow paralysis. For example, it would be difficult to implement basic gameplay features when the necessary scripting tools hadn't been finalized by the engine team yet. Proprietary engines pose a ton of unique challenges, With something like Unreal Engine, there is an uncountable number of resources, documentation, and it's all available to anyone on the internet. You, as a company, could hire any Unreal expert you need, and furthermore, anyone off the streets can Google tutorials and become proficient in the engine, tremendously reducing the amount of onboarding that needs to be done by anyone coming onto the project. Building your own internal engine means that there has to be great documentation. Otherwise, it's next to impossible for new people to come onto your project and work efficiently. This exact problem was highlighted by Naoki Yoshida, and why he didn't use Final Fantasy XV's Luminous engine, with him saying in an interview with Mary Station, "There's a reason we didn't use Luminous. When we started working on Final Fantasy XVI, they were still working on Final Fantasy XV. I think on the DLC. They hadn't created a manual for Luminous yet, so the studio couldn't provide us with support because they were focused on their own game, so we knew it wasn't going to work." 2014 was a time of both hope and worry for fans. The company had announced that Tabata would replace Nomura as the director of Final Fantasy XV. While Tabata had internally joined as co-director in July 2012, Square Enix did not confirm Nomura's departure until 2014. This caused a lot of concern among fans as the game had already been in development for so long. A director shift on top of this seemed incredibly troubling. At the time, CEO Yosuke Matsuda explained that the shift was made to allow Nomura to entirely focus on Kingdom Hearts 3 and the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Tabata's specific mandate was to bring the project to a final shipped release. Upon taking over, Tabata revealed that while the game had been in development for years, it was only 50 to 60% complete as of late 2014, which at the same time also made fans uneasy as it meant the game was still several years away. Tabata was acutely aware of all the anxieties this would cause. While the team felt demoralized while working on this project, he also understood that fans were also feeling the same disconnect. Taking direct inspiration from Naoki Yoshida's producer live letters for Final Fantasy XIV, he decided to implement a similar broadcast for Final Fantasy XV known as the Active Time Report. Recognizing that the black box nature of Versus 13's decade-long development had bred a culture of silence and disappointment, Tabata used these live streams to provide an unprecedented level of transparency. Traditional video game marketing cycles tend to rely on polished trailers. However, the ATRs were the antithesis of this. It made fans feel like they were in the studio working on the game too. And in hindsight, they might have overdid it, sometimes showing off environments that weren't even finished, as well as progress reports that would keep us updated on how the tech behind the game was evolving. But this is when a lot of the harsh reality around the game's transition away from Final Fantasy Versus 13 would set in. A brand new heroine would show up in the 2014 Tokyo Game Show trailer named Lunafreya Nox Fleuret. At this time, Tabata had not confirmed the story's original heroine had been removed from the game, and wouldn't for another year. Combine this with Lunafreya's different but similar look, as well as the same family name, and fans began to speculate at the time that Lunafreya and Stella were sisters, especially since Luna meant moon and Stella meant star. Them being sisters seemed to make a lot of sense, but in hindsight, it is absolutely hilarious. There's early concept art of them reworking Stella into Lunafreya. During this time, Lunafreya has a sort of in-between appearance, where in some ways she still looks like her original Stella design, but in others it was clear she was transitioning into Lunafreya. But what I can't get over is her and Noctis being able to talk on the phone. This is something that they actually considered and drew out. This would have greatly improved the romance between Lunafreya and Noctis, as they would have had a long-distance relationship in the way that many people do in the modern day. But this was scrapped, at least according to Tabata, because he says, and I kid you not, the dog and the notebook were more romantic. This was later retconned into cell phones only being a Lucis technology. But considering that Lunafreya was in Lucis during the invasion, how hard would it have been to just give her a phone? But tangent aside, fans would soon learn that Lunafreya and Stella were not sisters, and something far more insane was actually going on. It would be that following year in 2015, where Tabata had to share many harsh truths with fans fans about the realities and circumstances surrounding the game's development. Nomura's original plan for this game was to continue with direct sequels, which he called the Versus Epic. Though with him being forced to step away from this project to work on Kingdom Hearts 3 and FF7 Remake, the company decided that this epic needed to be condensed into a single video game. Combine this mandate with the need to remove overt references to worshipping a goddess of death and all things surrounding it, and you get a fundamentally different story than what Nomura was trying to convey. This meant that several aspects of the game had to be cut down and entirely transformed, with Tabata saying on the matter of compressing it down to one game, that was an important decision, one made at the company level too. So I started thinking about how we could get a full, coherent story in a single game, and the crux of that was which elements from Versus 13 we could carry over, and which would not fit into the new structure as 15. But it would have been very difficult to carry over absolutely everything as it was. We considered what was possible with the new gen hardware, as well as what elements absolutely must be included in 15, but might fall through if not given top priority. Everyone involved was very sensitive in dealing with this, and we patiently debated numerous times, but we still couldn't come up with a definitive answer. In the end, we decided to be as faithful as possible to Mr. Nojima's story for Versus, and focus on realizing the original story as much as we could. It goes without saying that I consulted with him on this, and he said that if I valued his original story, then it would still fulfill his vision, even if not every single element he came up with was included in the end. So that gave us confidence to set our goal, which was to create a narrative that utilizes Mr. Nojima's original story as fully as possible. If you ever felt like the second half of the game feels rushed and incoherent, seemingly rushing to immediately resolve itself, it's likely because those aspects of the game are compressed concepts from Versus 13 sequels that had to be delivered in minutes. But of course, the most polarizing casualty of this narrative compression was the complete removal of Stella Ffxv, the original heroine of Versus 13. For years, fans had been captivated by the dynamic between Noctis and Stella. Their relationship was framed as both romantic and adversarial, with trailers famously showing them pointing swords at one another during the invasion of Insomnia. However, the removal of the game's core themes around Reaper worship and being compressed into a single game, Tabata's team concluded that Stella's specific character arc could never make sense in the story they were trying to rework. To make the story coherent in a single title, Stella was replaced by Lunafreya Ffxv, a character who, while sharing a last name and basic design silhouette, served a fundamentally different narrative purpose. The shift from Stella to Luna also meant losing the rival heroine dynamic, something that was going to be incredibly subversive for the FF series. Instead, Luna would be a much more traditional, sacrificial oracle archetype, and this gave the feeling that they were going from subverting tropes to being the tropiest trope that ever troped. Tabata explained that it was difficult to maintain Stella's original role while streamlining the plot. This change effectively erased the core tension that fans had anticipated for nearly a decade, and is a grievance about the game that is still felt all these years later. One of the most major reworks that came to 15's plot was the removal of Insomnia's invasion. This was devastating, as it was one of the most iconic scenes from the project that had been featured in almost all the trailers since the game's announcement. Fans associated Versus the most with the iconic imagery of this scene, so its removal felt like a mortal wound to the community. But there is a deep reason behind this, and this reason explains almost everything that happened with Final Fantasy XV. Internally, it was decided that the game had to be released by the end of 2016. To put this in perspective, God of War 2018 took around 5 years of development time, or perhaps more comparable open-world action RPG Horizon Zero Dawn took around 6 years of development time. With Final Fantasy XV being rebooted internally in July 2012, they had to make a game and an engine in just 4 years, and it had to represent 10 years worth of fan expectations. Every single creative decision was weighed against the immovable 2016 deadline. To meet the shipping date, the team had to begin to make many compromises to the game. doing things such as consolidating the game's second half into a linear experience, stripping away explorable regions like Tenebrae and the entire nation of Accordo down to the mere city-state of Altissia. It's also why in the game, many of these locations are still very well modeled and appear as though they were meant for much more. They were, but given all these restrictions, Final Fantasy XV had to be cut down. So when looking at the Insomnia invasion, the game's opening act, and just how long it was going to take just to make that opening scene alone, the choice became clear to Tabata and the team that it was no longer feasible for them to keep the Insomnia invasion as playable content. The solution to this developmental bottleneck was the birth of Ffxv, a feature-length CGI film that would inherit the burden of the game's missing prologue. By offloading the fall of Insomnia to an external production team, the game development team could bypass the technical nightmare of building the invasion scenario, as making this playable content would have required years of asset creation and optimization. So the cinematic team at VisualWorks could render this all out as a film, rather than as a core gameplay experience. This allowed Tabata to meet the 2016 deadline, but it fundamentally fractured the game's narrative experience. It ultimately meant that moments that Noctis was meant to have with Lunafreya were instead given to Nyx, which of course led to a huge disconnect. A thought that I couldn't help but have is, why make a separate film? Couldn't you instead have VisualWorks making 2 hours worth of CGI cutscenes for the main Final Fantasy XV game to fill in all the plot holes? Unfortunately, Ffxv made an exceptional piece of marketing. The film itself probably did not make a profit, but even if it broke even or came close to, while also being the perfect marketing tool for the game, meant that it was much more valuable than putting those cutscenes in the actual game, even if that created a better product overall. The unfortunate reality is, there was more financial incentive to making it a separate film than there was to making a comprehensive, complete product. Noctis' Japanese voice actor, Tatsuhisa Suzuki, said that Final Fantasy XV's original script was 3 times longer than what ended up in Final Fantasy XV. The reason for this is that, according to him, most of this was reworked into Ffxv. To give some perspective, a few years back, Tim Rogers did an analysis where he showed that 30% of Final Fantasy VII's entire written dialogue is just Midgar. Mind you, on an average playthrough, Midgar takes maybe 4 hours. But it's next to impossible to imagine Final Fantasy VII's story without Midgar. It establishes the relationship between Cloud and all the characters, sets up the mysteries for who Jenova and Sephiroth are, builds the mystery for Cloud's identity. In many ways, it's one of the most crucial parts of Final Fantasy VII's story. It sets up all the mysteries that come after. And the Insomnia invasion was more than just 30% of the script. It was 66% of the script, at least according to Suzuki. So imagine losing something twice the size of Midgar. What you'd have is a fundamentally shattered narrative. This strategy of outsourcing the game's narrative was further extended through Brotherhood, a 5-episode anime series that served as a narrative band-aid for the party's lack of in-game development. The team had to get a game out and fast, and because the 4-year production sprint left no room for expansive character-building flashbacks, the decision was made to move all of this into a separate animated series that could be watched on YouTube. This again would serve as promotional material for the game and preserve these important stories to understanding the characters' backgrounds, even though they couldn't fit them into the actual game. All of this was done in service to making the game release as soon as possible, on time, and on budget. This is also why they removed playable party members. Initially, Tabata presented this as an artistic choice, but I don't think this is likely to be the case, because as soon as these character DLCs were finished, they immediately patched in character switching to the main game, which is to say, they used Season Pass content to finish creating the rest of the characters so that they could keep developing the game even after it was finished. Tabata and his team were determined to figure out a way to deliver players on the promises they had made, even if it meant the content was coming in unconventional ways. The changes from what Final Fantasy Versus 13 promised to what Final Fantasy 15 was going to deliver were adding up. In truth, even the game's logo didn't actually make sense anymore. The logo was originally meant to depict the goddess Etro sleeping, but since Etro was no longer in the game, this logo logo doesn't actually mean much in the context of 15's narrative. It was retconned to be Luna Freya, and it's why the logo changes after you beat the game in an attempt to represent something that does represent the finished game's plot. Due to the long silence and all the worries around the game changing, Tabata wanted players to get their hands on it as soon as possible, both to help alleviate concerns but also for fans to provide feedback. The result was Episode Duskai, a playable demo bundled with the release of Final Fantasy Type 0 HD. Duskai served as proof to players waiting for nearly a decade at this point for the game. It allowed players to explore a massive open section of the Duskai region, test the real-time combat system, and experience the bromance of the main cast firsthand. However, Tabata's goal wasn't just promotion. He viewed the demo as a massive beta test. Following its release, Square Enix launched a global user feedback survey. This led to the release of Episode Duskai 2.0 in June 2015, an update to a demo that specifically addresses player complaints. This version introduced new combat maneuvers, improved camera, added cross-chain attacks, and marked the first time that Final Fantasy fans were actively participating in the game's development process. While this level of transparency succeeded in winning back a significant portion of the disillusioned fanbase, and also revealed the frantic nature of this game's development. They were kind of designing this game and building it in real time, which turned the fanbase into a secondary QA department. All of this happened while the team raced to finish a world-class engine and build an open-world action RPG simultaneously before the clock ran out in 2016. When the year finally did come, Final Fantasy XV would go into overdrive. A massive event called Uncovered Final Fantasy XV would be held in Los Angeles on March 31st. Uncovered was out of this world incredible as an event. Several announcements, trailers, brand new live gameplay demonstrations, the announcement of Kingsglaive and Brotherhood, and the fact that Florence and the Machine would have a cover of Stand By Me made just for Final Fantasy XV. It was revealed to the public that Final Fantasy XV was more than just the release of a single game. It was an entire universe, and fans had been starved for this game for so many years. It felt like Christmas. Final Fantasy XIII Trilogy was incredibly divisive, and Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 wasn't a distant memory like it is now. This left many fans hoping that 15 would be a return to form. To ease these concerns, Tabata invited Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of the FF series, to give the opening speech for the night. For many fans, it felt like everything fell apart after he left, and so for 15 to have his approval meant that Final Fantasy was getting back on track. Sakaguchi even had a great line empathizing with fans on how unfortunate FF's direction was at the time.
ただですね、父親というのは、子供が正しい道を歩んでいるか、You know,
in English, will always and forever send me. But he reassured fans, in his words, Final Fantasy had rediscovered its true nature. As a fan of this series, you couldn't help but be excited. But it wasn't just Sakaguchi. They also had Uematsu, Yoshitaka Amano, and all the familiar faces of Final Fantasy except one. One important face whose absence I couldn't help but notice. And not only was his face not present, he was not mentioned even one time throughout the entire night of a full 3-hour stream and a 2-hour presentation that did go out of its way to mention everyone who's ever touched a Final Fantasy game. No thanks to him for creating the original concept, no thanks to him for creating the characters other than his usual obligatory legal footer. There's lots of reasons for why this could be, but considering Nomura's multiple, let's just say, commentary pieces regarding the situation, it's extraordinarily difficult for me to see this as something that was amicable. In fact, he wasn't even allowed to talk about Versus. In the Dissidia NT livestream that aired in October 2019, announcing Noctis's Versus 13 garb for the game, the conversation went Kujiroka. This costume was actually from Versus 13's costume, Nomura. Wait, We're allowed to say that name? Ryoka. Yeah, it's okay. Nomura. Because before, it was not allowed. Hazama. Oh, it's complicated, but it's okay now. Nomura. This costume was always a prototype. The one he is wearing in 15 is the real one. I was involved with it until that. There are lots of things I can't say. One day, I'll write about it in a book. Jokingly, not serious of course. The MC saying, the book will be published by someone other than Square Enix, lol. The company would not even allow Nomura to talk about Versus 13. But Nomura wasn't the only one that got screwed over by the handling of this situation, and we'll talk more about that later. However, the Uncovered event was an insane success. Final Fantasy XV was slated to release on September 30th, which would absolutely not happen. Everything seemed like it was going incredibly well. Final Fantasy XV was going to be released after a 10-year wait. It was unbelievable. Fans were feeling an all-time high knowing that the game they had been waiting for was finally coming, but behind the curtain, an absolute disaster was brewing. And in a very rare occurrence in gaming, a 4chan rumor turned out to be almost entirely legitimate. In this rumor posted in June of 2016, not only did he accurately describe almost everything he was asked about the final game, he also foretold of the game's delay, with him saying that the game wasn't even playable on console hardware yet. Quote, there's only like 2 hours playable on PS4 and the Xbox version barely turns on. Nobody is thinking about PS4K. Note that is PS4 Pro. Just porting and optimizing for PS4. Xbox build is like 3 weeks behind. It was finished and you could play it from start to finish on high-end PCs they made it on, but the PS4 port is a mess, and they started design and rewrites after normal wrap because it's going over like people, like pickup shots to fix a movie. When asked how could the game be so unfinished yet still being worked on a few months from release, he said, it's not normal. The lock for English voice recording was supposed to be in 3 weeks, but they keep rewriting lines. Everyone is nervous as fuck about the September 30th release. Expect a big day one patch. At the time, no one believed this rumor. After all, Episode Duskai and Platinum Demo showed everyone a functioning game. Tabata's transparency gave them absolutely no reason to doubt the game's progress. But in truth, this was pointing to the coming storm. Final Fantasy XV's development was absolutely breaking down. Then it happened. On August 15th, just 5 months after the Uncovered event where the release date was announced, Tabata confirmed that Final Fantasy XV would be delayed. Funniest moment in this series' entire history is how they accidentally revealed that they were already considering delaying Final Fantasy XV while they were announcing its release date. Final Fantasy XV's release was initially planned for September 30th, 2016. This was revealed at the end of Uncovered, but just before the slot machine-like calendar animation stopped on September 30th, it did this thing where it kind of hung up on November 30th for a second. This is hilarious because it would later be revealed that the game was delayed until November 29th. It tells me the team already knew they would need those extra 2 months to finish the game, but they were committed to not delaying the game any further. But when it came down to it, despite all the cuts they had made in an attempt to get the game out faster, they still had to compromise with one last delay. This was incredibly demoralizing to fans at the time. Even though it was just 2 more months, felt like adding salt to a wound when the game had already been delayed for so long. Little did fans know at the time, they would have wished this game was delayed even further. That October, the game went gold, and alongside it, they released the Omen trailer. This continued the long-standing trend since the Versus days of having one of the best trailers that you've ever seen in your life. The dark tone of this trailer, showing Noctis and Lunafreya battling, this seemed to resurface a lot of elements from Versus 13, giving fans one last bit of reassurance that maybe all of those elements were still present in Final Fantasy XV's final game. It was November 28th, and finally the game's review embargo had lifted, just a day before launch. Reviews were mostly good, with the game having a solid 81 Metacritic, though technically this would make it the lowest rated mainline numbered Final Fantasy. During that day, reading the reviews, as a fan, I just thought many of the complaints around the story being incomprehensive and incomplete were holdovers from the anti-JRPG sentiment of the past generation. Then the game launched. The first few hours of Final Fantasy XV 15's launch felt amazing. The game opened with a boundless sense of freedom. Driving through the open world, making recipes, and exploring gave a brand new sense of adventure to Final Fantasy. Initially, combat seemed genuinely exciting, with this being the game's first attempt at action. But as players went through the story, they began to notice some things. Several plot points from the trailers that they had imagined playing all these years weren't there. Or if they were there, they were heavily reworked. One of the most anticipated moments from Final Fantasy XV's reveal was the Leviathan fight, which featured a scale that could even make a game like Uncharted blush. Yet in the final game, this had been entirely reworked to something that, while still impressive, was far less grand. There were numerous reasons that so many of these things didn't make it in. Moments like the Leviathan fight had to be reworked, as the hardware in the engine simply couldn't support it. And after years of fantasizing about how Stella Nox Fleuret could play out in Final Fantasy Versus 13, fans were confronted with the reality of Lunafreya. I think it would have been easy to shift expectations to favor Lunafreya if this character had more substance and screen time to her. Instead, it felt like she just shows up to be like, Noctis, you must fulfill your duty, as must I as the Oracle, and then immediately dies the moment you get within 5 feet of her. The problem here wasn't that Stella would have been better than Lunafreya. The real problem is, there is no Lunafreya. But it wasn't just Lunafreya. Many of the game's character arcs simply feel incomplete. So many important characters just show up and immediately die, or die off screen, or have no elaboration for why they existed. It was incredibly baffling. To add insult to injury, it felt as though the entire story of the game was shoved into the second half. A linear section, which killed the fun open world camping vibes of the first half of the game, to linear corridors where the actual majority of the story takes place and feels incredibly rushed. And prior to the Royal Edition, there really was no final dungeon, and a lot of plot points were just outright incomprehensible. Let me back up. This isn't a review of Final Fantasy XV, but it is important to highlight these sentiments because there's a legitimate story behind why so many elements felt like they were going to be so grandiose and then fell short in their actual implementation. Final Fantasy XV, when you play straight through it, is one of the shortest mainline FF games ever. Even with the Royal Edition's new dungeon, if you play straight through the game's main content, it can be completed in roughly 15 hours. I know this because I've done exactly that before. This game is insanely lean, and it's very obvious the original intention wasn't to make it so barren. FF15's disjointed nature came down to 3 essential points. 1, the game could no longer maintain its theme of Reaper worship and themes surrounding death, due to Square Enix as a corporation deciding they wanted to sell the game in all regions, including those where this would be a violation, as it was suspected to be for China back in 2016. 2, roughly a year into development, they basically got told you can't do the Versus trilogy anymore. It has to be reworked into one game. This basically left them scrambling and throwing things together in order to compress it all into a single title. They'd have to cut multiple important moments from the game, and in order to keep them in the story, they'd have to turn them into a DLC, a film, an animated series, etc., in order for the game to meet its fixed release window of the end of 2016. And 3, they had to develop a world-class engine and open-world action RPG in just 4 years that had to continuously make changes to its original vision. For comparison, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth took just over 3 years, and that's with an engine, assets, and code ready to go. And the game didn't have to rework its entire story in its early middle life. When you factor all these things in, why Final Fantasy Versus 13's vision became the reality of Final Fantasy 15 makes complete sense. This is where a lot of people talk about the concept of Nobuna's revenge. I'm not going to speculate on how he feels about Tabata, but I will say, if anyone is responsible for ruining Versus 13, it would be former CEO Yosuke Matsuda and Square Enix's upper management at the time, who made all of those decisions that forced Nomura and Tabata Tabata into a box. Nomura may or may not feel something toward Tabata for not fulfilling his vision, but I think that's irrelevant from this standpoint. The real situation here is about creatives versus the corporate figureheads who just honestly don't give a damn, compounded with years of mismanagement. The situation with Versus and 15 started with 13's own development issues. The company rushed together an engine to get that game out the door, not realizing how badly it would screw over every other project that was supposed to run on that engine. Then they had to take staff off of Versus to work on FF14's revamp. Then the entire generation went by and they had to restart development. Then the company comes in the middle and condenses the trilogy into one game, removes the core themes, and still tries to make it look like the previous game in an attempt to capitalize on its hype, all while having a fraction of the time necessary to do so. The cancellation of Versus wasn't Nomura's fault, and believe it or not, the failures of Final Fantasy XV wasn't Tabata's fault either, but it is the direct consequence of a decade and a half of mismanagement compounding on top of each other. When reviewing the evidence, the truth here is self-evident. Though all this being said, I must give credit where credit is due. Hajime Tabata heard from fans and tried his hardest after Final Fantasy XV's launch to push Square Enix and the team to finish the game, even if retroactively. Once the first round of DLC was complete, there was still more hunger for Final Fantasy XV. Tabata officially announced a second wave of content coming, called The Dawn of the Future. This massive roadmap was a direct response to fans who felt the 2016 release hadn't fully delivered on its narrative potential. The project consisted of 4 new episodes: Episode Arden, Aranea, Lunafreya, and Episode Noctis. Unlike the first season pass, which filled the gaps in for the main party, this second season pass was designed to provide an alternate grand finale. This new season aimed to challenge the destined tragedies of the base game, allowing characters to defy their fates and forge a new hopeful ending. It would also come with brand new animated short films that would help expand on the characters and bring a sense of fulfillment to their character arcs. Furthermore, and this is where I was most excited, the team was also working on modding tools that would allow players to completely change the game how they see fit. This would include both a level editor and a way to re-script the game entirely. The team even showed you can use these tools to make a golfing minigame. Dawn of the Future and another round of patches would try to fill the void for players, and if all that wasn't enough, the modding tools would allow fans to finish Final Fantasy XV in whatever way they saw fit. This all seemed incredible. Final Fantasy XV was going to reach a state where fans could walk away satisfied, even if its development had to continue for many years after its launch. Fans were excited for more concise details and a precise roadmap for this content, so when Square Enix announced their second anniversary livestream, the hype went into overdrive. But what should have been a hopeful stream turned out to be arguably the darkest day in the Final Fantasy franchise's entire history. The stream started with Hajime Tabata notably missing, and them sending out brand manager Akio Ofuji to take the fall for what the corporation had decided. Square Enix had cancelled all of the DLCs except for Episode Arden, which was already finished, and this included all upcoming patch content as well as the modding tools. To make this even worse, the director of Final Fantasy XV had also left the company. Both parties presented this as an amicable departure, but if I'm speaking frankly, I find that extraordinarily hard to believe. Tabata had been publicly facing the entirety of Final Fantasy XV's development, and every second thereafter, it seemed incredibly sudden and demoralizing that he would just up and leave. Square Enix was rebuilding trust with Final Fantasy XV by trying to fix it, but by canceling all of this content, it destroyed trust even further. Perhaps the best way to put this is, imagine if CD Projekt Red canceled the 2.0 update and Phantom Liberty. You wouldn't be able to trust anything they were putting out ever again after that, and all the goodwill that they had initially put into Cyberpunk's patches would be for naught. It'd be especially hard if during that exact same time they were trying to sell you a 3-part remake of The Witcher 1. There's also the question of Tabata resigning and this coinciding with the cancellation of Dawn of the Future. For starters, his supposed resignation came extraordinarily sudden. Just a few months prior, Square Enix gave him his own external studio and allowed him to make whatever he wanted to. This happened in March, and the resignation came at the end of October and was announced in November. It's not every day that you see a major corporation grant a high-profile director his own semi-autonomous studio, only to have that director resign less than 8 months later, only for Tabata to then say he couldn't make the kind of games that he wanted to at Square Enix. Something there just does not add up. While the narrative at the time painted a picture of him moving on to more personal ventures, there was definitely a conflict between him and Yosuke Matsuda. Tabata revealed 5 years later in 2023 via a 4Gamer interview that the reason he departed from Square Enix was due to differing philosophies from the then CEO, with him saying, "It's been so many years, I don't remember the details anymore," he laughed. But the gist is, I had differences in policy with the president of Square Enix at the time, and as a company, we naturally had to follow the president's policies. So I couldn't do what I thought I should do. I thought it would be impossible to continue working there for many years after that, so I decided to go independent. It was difficult to be honest about that at first, but I think it's fine now. It seems to me that this dispute was the breaking point, and might have forced Tabata out of his position. It's really difficult to imagine he would have left under any other circumstances. He's expressed on quite a few occasions how sad he was he couldn't finish the game. But despite all of these things, there is still something undeniably human and, dare I even say, soulful about Final Fantasy XV. The developers working on this game were exhausted and fretful, but they refused to let the Final Fantasy brand die, and the fan base refused to stop hoping for 10 years, and even many years after the game was released. Whether you view this as a masterwork or an absolute disaster, it's incredible that the developers were even able to make a functioning engine and game within this short amount of time. We may never get the Dawn of the Future content as it was intended, we may never get Versus 13, or just any closure on this project in general. But for all those who've been there with this project since the first trailer in 2006 and have witnessed its many incarnations, we formed bonds that the corporate machine could never take away from us. And until then, we'll keep hoping for the complete version of this vision, that it may one day arise.